Karen Thompson had always dreamed of visiting London. To her, it was the land of royalty, red phone booths, and tea served in delicate china cups. A middle-aged woman from a small town in America, Karen thought of herself as adventurous and worldly, even though most of her knowledge about other countries came from TV shows and social media. She loved posting pictures online, captioning them with her opinions about everything, from politics to fashion. Her followers were used to her bold statements, but not everyone agreed with her views. Still, Karen didn't care. She lived for attention, whether good or bad. The day she landed in London, Karen felt like a celebrity. She checked into a fancy hotel near Buckingham Palace, imagining herself sipping champagne while watching the royal guards march by. But Karen wasn't there to learn about history or culture. She was there to take selfies and brag about her trip back home. By the second day, she had already visited Big Ben, Tower Bridge, and the London Eye, filling her Instagram feed with filtered photos and dramatic captions. On the third morning, Karen decided to see the famous changing of the guard ceremony at Buckingham Palace. "This will be so boring," she muttered under her breath as she walked toward the palace, clutching her designer handbag. Inside, she carried a tiny bottle of bright orange paint she bought earlier that day as a quirky souvenir. The shopkeeper had joked that it looked like the color of traffic cones, and Karen laughed, thinking it would make a funny story to tell her friends later. Little did she know how much trouble that little bottle would cause. When Karen arrived at the palace gates, the crowd was thick with tourists snapping photos and families pointing excitedly at the guards. The guards, dressed in their striking red uniforms and tall furry hats, stood perfectly still, ignoring the chatter around them. Karen watched one guard in particular, fascinated by his stoic expression. She wondered what it would take to crack him, to make him flinch or react in any way. At first, it was just a passing thought, but then an idea sparked in her mind. What if she could test his patience? Wouldn't it be funny to shake things up a bit? Karen stepped closer to the barrier, her heels clicking against the pavement. She leaned forward slightly, smirking as she called out, "Hey, you." "Yeah, you in the hat." The guard didn't move a muscle. His unwavering composure annoyed her. How dare he ignore her? She tried again, louder this time, calling him names and making sarcastic comments about his outfit. Other tourists turned to look, some rolling their eyes, others whispering disapprovingly. But Karen didn't notice, or maybe she didn't care. All she cared about was getting a reaction. Her frustration grew when the guard continued to stand silently, staring straight ahead as if she didn't exist. That's when Karen made a decision, a reckless, impulsive choice that would change her life forever. Clutching the bottle of paint tightly in her hand, she glanced around to see if anyone was paying attention. Most people seemed distracted, more interested in taking pictures than noticing the angry woman edging closer to the guard. With a mix of adrenaline and bravado, Karen unscrewed the cap of the paint bottle, her heart pounding in anticipation. She told herself it was all in good fun, but deep down, something darker was driving her. A need to assert power, to prove she could do whatever she wanted without consequences. And in that moment, nothing else mattered. Karen's grip tightened around the small bottle of paint as a mischievous grin spread across her face. She glanced around once more, ensuring no one was watching her too closely. The crowd was still buzzing with energy, snapping photos and chatting excitedly about the ceremony. No one seemed to notice the woman standing just a little too close to the barrier, holding something suspicious in her hand. With a quick flick of her wrist, Karen tilted the bottle and poured its bright orange contents directly onto the guard's head. The thick liquid cascaded down his red uniform, staining the pristine fabric and dripping onto his polished black boots. For a moment, everything went silent. Even the chatter of the crowd seemed to fade into the background as everyone turned to stare at what had just happened. The guard, true to his training, didn't move a muscle. His expression remained completely blank, but the shock on the faces of those around him said it all. Gasps echoed through the air as people realized what they were witnessing. Karen stepped back, laughing nervously at first, clearly expecting some kind of reaction. Anger, surprise, anything. But when the guard continued to stand perfectly still, her laughter grew louder, almost hysterical. "What's wrong with you?" she shouted, pointing at him. "Can't you even blink? Are you real or just some statue?" Her voice carried over the murmurs of the crowd, drawing even more attention to herself. Some people shook their heads in disbelief, while others pulled out their phones to capture the bizarre scene unfolding before them. But Karen wasn't done yet. Emboldened by the chaos she created, she leaned closer to the guard, waving her arms dramatically. "You think you're so special in your fancy hat? You're nothing," she yelled, her tone sharp and mocking. A few bystanders began whispering among themselves, their voices tinged with disapproval. One man muttered loud enough for Karen to hear, "That's really disrespectful." Another woman shook her head, saying, "Who does that? This is ridiculous." Security personnel stationed nearby quickly sprang into action, rushing toward Karen with stern expressions. "Ma'am, step away from the barrier immediately," one officer commanded, his voice firm and authoritative. But instead of complying, Karen doubled down, raising her voice even higher. "Why should I listen to you? He deserved it," she snapped, gesturing wildly at the paint-covered guard. Her words came fast and furious now, each sentence more unhinged than the last. She accused the guards of being outdated and useless, ranting about how they were wasting taxpayers' money by standing around doing nothing. As the officers tried to calm her down, Karen became increasingly agitated. She swatted at their hands when they reached for her arms, shouting louder with every attempt to restrain her. "Get off me. I didn't do anything wrong," she screamed, her face turning red with anger. By this point, dozens of phones were pointed in her direction, capturing every word and movement. Videos of the incident began uploading to social media within seconds, spreading like wildfire across platforms. Comments flooded in, condemning Karen's actions and labeling her behavior as outrageous and unacceptable. The situation escalated further when Karen made a comment about the guard's appearance, implying he didn't belong in his uniform because of his skin color. Though she didn't use explicit language, the implication was clear and devastating. The crowd erupted in murmurs of outrage, and several people openly confronted her, calling her behavior shameful and racist. Security finally managed to drag her away from the scene, but not before she left behind a trail of destruction, not just for the guard she had humiliated, but for herself as well. As Karen was dragged away from the scene, her heels scraping against the pavement, she struggled fiercely against the firm grip of the security officers. Her face was flushed red, a mix of embarrassment and fury etched into her features. "Let me go," she shrieked, twisting her arms in vain as the crowd watched silently, their expressions ranging from disbelief to disgust. A few people shook their heads, while others whispered among themselves, clearly appalled by what they had just witnessed. Some parents covered their children's eyes, shielding them from the spectacle unfolding before them. The soaked guard, now a figure of both sympathy and admiration, was escorted away by fellow guards who moved swiftly to protect him from further humiliation. His uniform, once immaculate and symbolic of tradition, was now streaked with bright orange paint that dripped onto the ground as he walked. Despite the chaos, his composure never wavered. Not a single flinch or glance in Karen's direction betrayed any emotion. It was this unshakable professionalism that struck a chord with the onlookers, many of whom began clapping softly in support of the guard. The applause grew louder, drowning out Karen's protests as she continued to yell at the officers holding her back. Meanwhile, the videos capturing the incident spread like wildfire online. Within minutes, hashtags like #RoyalGuardRespect and #TouristTantrum started trending on social media platforms. People from all over the world weighed in, sharing their thoughts about Karen's actions. Comments poured in, condemning her behavior and praising the guard for maintaining his dignity despite the provocation. One user wrote, "This is why we respect traditions, because they stand tall even when faced with ignorance." Another added, "That poor guard didn't deserve this. Hope justice is served." Back at the palace gates, the mood shifted dramatically after Karen was removed from the area. Tourists resumed taking photos, but the atmosphere felt different, somber, almost reflective. Many couldn't help but glance at the spot where the incident had occurred, imagining how quickly things had spiraled out of control. Some visitors approached the remaining guards to express their support, thanking them for their service and apologizing for Karen's behavior. The guards, ever stoic, simply nodded politely, their training preventing them from engaging in conversation. For Karen, however, the nightmare was only beginning. As she was led into a nearby security office, her bravado began to crumble. She sat slumped in a chair, her designer clothes disheveled, her makeup smeared from sweating. An officer placed a phone on the table in front of her, showing her clips of the incident that were already going viral. Her eyes widened as she scrolled through comments calling her entitled, rude, and disrespectful. For the first time since the ordeal began, Karen looked genuinely shaken. "You realize this isn't just about ruining someone's day," the officer said sternly, breaking the tense silence. "What you did is considered vandalism and public disturbance, and based on witness statements." He paused, glancing at his notes before continuing. "There may be additional charges depending on what exactly was said during your outburst." Karen opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. She stared blankly at the table, her mind racing as the weight of her actions slowly sank in. Outside, the crowd began dispersing, but the ripple effects of Karen's behavior lingered. News outlets picked up the story, broadcasting footage of the paint-drenched guard and interviews with shocked tourists. Back in America, Karen's name became synonymous with bad behavior abroad. Friends and acquaintances who had once tolerated her outspoken nature now found themselves distancing from her, embarrassed by association. Even strangers chimed in, criticizing not just her actions, but also the sense of entitlement that seemed to fuel them. By the end of the day, Karen's dream vacation had turned into a living nightmare. What started as a reckless impulse, a momentary desire to provoke a reaction, had spiraled into something far bigger than she could have imagined. As she sat alone in the security office, surrounded by officers preparing reports and evidence, Karen realized that her life would never be the same again. By the time Karen returned to America, her face had become infamous. The video of her drenching the royal guard in paint had been viewed millions of times online, and screenshots of her angry outburst were plastered across news websites and social media platforms. Friends who once laughed at her jokes or nodded politely during her rants now avoided her calls and unfollowed her on social media. Even her neighbors gave her cold stares when she passed by, whispering behind her back about the paint lady who embarrassed herself and an entire nation on camera. Her employer, a mid-sized marketing firm where Karen worked as an account manager, was hit hard by the backlash. Clients began pulling contracts after seeing their brand associated with someone labeled as disrespectful and entitled. Emails flooded into the company's inbox, demanding answers about why they employed such a person. Within days, Karen received a formal termination letter stating that her actions had damaged the company's reputation beyond repair. Her boss, who had always tolerated her outspoken nature, refused to meet with her face-to-face, leaving her to process the news alone in her apartment. But losing her job was just the beginning. Local news stations picked up the story, airing segments about Karen's behavior under headlines like "American Tourist Causes Chaos at Buckingham Palace." Reporters dug into her past, uncovering old social media posts filled with controversial opinions and insensitive remarks. These findings only fueled the fire, painting her as someone who consistently disregarded others' feelings for the sake of attention. Anonymous trolls joined the frenzy, flooding her email and social media accounts with hateful messages. Some even went so far as to send letters to her home address, calling her selfish and reckless. Karen tried to defend herself by posting apology videos on YouTube, hoping to salvage what remained of her reputation. In one clip, she sat in front of her phone camera, her eyes puffy from crying, and said, "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was just frustrated and acted without thinking." But viewers weren't convinced. Comments poured in accusing her of insincerity, pointing out that her words sounded rehearsed and lacked genuine remorse. One viewer wrote, "You're not sorry because you got caught. You're sorry because your life fell apart." The video ended up getting more dislikes than likes, forcing Karen to delete it within hours. Her family, too, struggled to come to terms with her actions. At first, her parents tried to offer support, reminding her that everyone makes mistakes. But as the public shaming intensified, they grew increasingly distant. Her siblings stopped answering her texts, and her mother left a voicemail saying, "We love you, but we can't keep defending you when you do things like this." When Karen called her brother for advice, he bluntly told her, "You brought this on yourself. Maybe it's time to take a long, hard look in the mirror." Financially, Karen found herself drowning. Without a steady income, she couldn't afford her luxurious lifestyle anymore. She sold her designer clothes and expensive handbags to cover rent and groceries, moving into a cramped studio apartment in a less than desirable part of town. Bills piled up faster than she could pay them off, and creditors began calling daily, threatening legal action if she didn't settle her debts. Nights became sleepless battles against anxiety as she lay awake wondering how she'd ever dig herself out of this hole. To make matters worse, crowdfunding campaigns emerged online, not for Karen, but for the guard she had humiliated. Thousands of dollars poured in from strangers eager to show their appreciation for his professionalism and dignity. Supporters organized events in his honor, celebrating him as a symbol of resilience and grace under pressure. Meanwhile, Karen sat alone in her tiny apartment, scrolling through updates about the very man whose life she had disrupted. Each new post felt like another reminder of how far she had fallen. As weeks turned into months, Karen realized that the consequences of her actions extended far beyond the moment she poured paint on a stranger. Her impulsive decision had cost her everything: her career, her relationships, her financial stability, and most painfully, her sense of self-worth. For the first time in her life, Karen felt truly isolated, unsure if she would ever find a way to rebuild what she had destroyed. Karen's legal troubles began shortly after her arrest in London. She was charged with multiple offenses, including vandalism, public disorder, and harassment. The prosecution argued that her actions were not only disrespectful, but also racially motivated, citing witness statements about her comments regarding the guard's appearance. Karen's defense team tried to downplay the severity of her behavior, claiming she had been under the influence of alcohol and hadn't intended to cause harm. They painted her as a tourist who had made a foolish mistake, urging leniency from the court. But the judge remained unconvinced. During the trial, prosecutors presented damning evidence, including video footage of the incident and testimonies from bystanders who described Karen's aggressive behavior. One witness recounted how she had mocked the guard's uniform and shouted insults, while another highlighted her racially insensitive remarks. These accounts painted a picture of someone acting out of entitlement and prejudice, rather than mere impulsivity. Karen sat quietly in the courtroom, her head bowed, as the weight of her actions pressed down on her. For the first time, she seemed to grasp the gravity of what she had done. The verdict came swiftly, guilty on all counts. Karen was sentenced to 6 months in prison and ordered to pay thousands of pounds in fines to cover damages and court costs. The judge emphasized that her behavior had disrespected not only the royal guards, but also British culture and traditions. "Your actions have consequences," he said sternly before delivering the sentence. Karen listened in stunned silence, tears streaming down her face as reality set in. Her dream vacation had turned into a nightmare, one that would leave lasting scars. After serving her time in a UK correctional facility, Karen faced yet another blow. Immigration authorities banned her from ever returning to the country. As she boarded the flight back to America, she felt like a shadow of her former self. Gone was the confident, outspoken woman who once strutted through life without a care. In her place was someone burdened by shame and regret, unsure of how to move forward. Back home, Karen struggled to adjust to her new reality. Finding employment proved nearly impossible. Every job application she submitted was met with rejection, often accompanied by vague excuses or no response at all. When she finally landed an interview for a part-time cashier position at a local grocery store, the manager recognized her immediately. "Aren't you?" he began, trailing off as his eyes widened in recognition. Karen nodded weakly, bracing herself for the inevitable dismissal. To her surprise, the manager sighed and said, "Look, I'll give you a chance, but don't make me regret it." It wasn't much, but it was a start. Living paycheck to paycheck became Karen's new normal. She rented a small, run-down apartment in a neighborhood she barely recognized, far removed from the upscale lifestyle she once enjoyed. Simple pleasures like eating out or buying new clothes were luxuries she could no longer afford. Nights were spent staring at the ceiling, replaying the events that led her here. She often wondered if things could have turned out differently, if she had walked away instead of pouring paint, if she had kept her temper in check, if she had thought twice before speaking. Despite the hardships, Karen began to notice subtle changes within herself. The isolation forced her to confront uncomfortable truths about her behavior and attitudes. She started reading books recommended by a counselor she reluctantly began seeing, focusing on topics like empathy, accountability, and cultural sensitivity. Slowly, painfully, she began to understand why her actions had caused such outrage. While the road ahead remained uncertain, Karen realized that rebuilding her life would require more than apologies. It would demand real change. And for the first time in months, she allowed herself to hope that maybe, just maybe, redemption was possible. Karen's journey toward redemption began in the unlikeliest of places, a small community center nestled in a quiet corner of her neighborhood. Desperate to escape the monotony of her isolated existence, she had wandered in one afternoon after seeing a flyer advertising volunteer opportunities. At first, she kept her identity hidden, introducing herself simply as Karen, without offering any details about her past. The staff didn't ask questions, they were just grateful for the extra help. Her initial tasks were simple: sorting donated clothes, organizing shelves, and serving snacks to children who came after school. But Karen soon found herself drawn to the center's youth mentorship program, where teenagers gathered to share their experiences and challenges. Many of them came from tough backgrounds, dealing with issues like poverty, discrimination, and bullying. One day, during a group discussion, a teenager named Malik spoke up. He talked about being judged because of his skin color, describing how people often made assumptions about him before getting to know him. Karen listened intently, her chest tightening as she recognized echoes of her own behavior in his story. After the session ended, she approached Malik hesitantly, unsure of what to say. "I'm sorry you've had to go through that," she finally managed, her voice trembling slightly. To her surprise, Malik smiled faintly and replied, "It's okay. Not everyone understands." That moment stayed with Karen long after she left the center. It sparked something inside her, a desire to learn, to grow, to make amends not just for herself but for others too. She started attending workshops on cultural awareness and systemic inequality, devouring books recommended by the center's director. Topics she had once dismissed as irrelevant now felt urgent and personal. For the first time in her life, Karen realized how much she didn't know, and how much harm ignorance could cause. As weeks turned into months, Karen became a regular fixture at the community center. The staff and participants grew to trust her, seeing glimpses of genuine effort behind her guarded demeanor. She began leading discussions about empathy and respect, sharing snippets of her own mistakes. Not explicitly, but enough to show she understood the weight of poor choices. Some teens teased her gently, calling her the quiet lady who always brings cookies. Others opened up to her, confiding in her about their struggles and dreams. Despite these small victories, Karen still faced moments of doubt. There were days when old habits crept back in, snapping at someone who cut her off in traffic or rolling her eyes at a news segment she disagreed with. Each slip felt like a step backward, reigniting the guilt she carried daily. But instead of letting it consume her, Karen used those moments as reminders of how far she still had to go. She started journaling, writing down thoughts and reflections each night to track her progress. On particularly hard days, she read entries from earlier months, marveling at how much she had changed already. Outside the community center, Karen continued to face judgment. Strangers occasionally recognized her in public, glaring or muttering under their breath. Once, while waiting in line at a coffee shop, a young woman loudly accused her of ruining England's reputation. Karen froze, her cheeks burning with shame. But instead of lashing out, she nodded quietly and said, "You're right. I'm working on being better." The woman looked taken aback, then walked away without another word. It wasn't forgiveness, but it was a start. Slowly, Karen began to see glimmers of hope. A local newspaper ran a feature on the community center, highlighting its impact on underserved youth. In the article, several participants praised Karen's dedication and kindness, unaware of her infamous past. Reading their words brought tears to her eyes, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. For the first time in years, Karen felt like she was contributing something meaningful, even if it was just a small part of a much larger effort. Though her life was far from perfect, Karen clung to these moments of connection and purpose. They reminded her that change wasn't about erasing the past, but building a future worth striving for. And while she knew she could never undo the damage she had caused, she vowed to keep moving forward, one small, deliberate step at a time. Karen's transformation wasn't immediate, nor was it easy. It took months of hard work, introspection, and a willingness to confront her own flaws head-on. But as she continued volunteering at the community center, something remarkable began to happen. People started noticing her efforts. One afternoon, while helping a group of teenagers prepare for a school project on social justice, Karen shared a story about how misunderstandings and assumptions can lead to hurtful actions. She didn't mention her past explicitly, but her words carried an authenticity that resonated with the room. Malik, who had initially been skeptical of Karen, became one of her strongest supporters. "You're different now," he told her one day after class. "Like, I don't know what happened before, but you're trying real hard to get it right." His words meant more to Karen than he could have imagined. For so long, she had felt like a burden to everyone around her, a constant reminder of bad behavior and poor judgment. Hearing Malik acknowledge her growth gave her the courage to keep pushing forward. Encouraged by the progress she'd made, Karen decided to take a bold step, writing a memoir. At first, the idea terrified her. How could she possibly explain herself without sounding defensive or self-pitying? But her counselor urged her to view it as an opportunity, not just for personal healing, but also for accountability. "People need to see that change is possible," he said during one session. "If you're honest about your mistakes, maybe others will learn from them." The writing process was grueling. Karen spent countless nights hunched over her laptop, revisiting painful memories and wrestling with emotions she thought she'd buried. She wrote candidly about her trip to London, describing the toxic mix of entitlement and impulsivity that led to her infamous outburst. She admitted to underestimating the impact of her words and actions, acknowledging the harm she had caused not only to the guard, but to countless others who watched the video. Most importantly, she detailed her journey toward understanding, how she came to realize the importance of empathy, respect, and cultural sensitivity. When the book was finally published, Karen braced herself for backlash. The title, From Ignorance to Awareness, A Journey Toward Redemption, was intentionally straightforward, leaving no room for ambiguity about its purpose. To her surprise, the response was mixed but ultimately encouraging. Some critics dismissed her story as insincere, accusing her of seeking attention or profit. Others, however, praised her honesty and vulnerability, calling the memoir a powerful example of owning up to one's mistakes. Readers shared messages thanking her for addressing uncomfortable truths about privilege and prejudice, saying her story inspired them to reflect on their own biases. To ensure her intentions were clear, Karen donated all proceeds from the book to organizations fighting racial injustice and promoting education. She also partnered with local schools to host workshops on empathy and accountability, using her experiences as a cautionary tale. During these sessions, she encouraged students to think critically about their actions and consider how they might affect others. "It's okay to make mistakes," she often said. "What matters is what you do afterward." Despite the positive feedback, Karen knew forgiveness wouldn't come easily or universally. Many still viewed her as the paint lady, unwilling to separate her from the worst moment of her life. But instead of letting bitterness take root, Karen chose to focus on the lives she touched through her work. She found joy in small victories: a teenager thanking her for advice, a teacher praising her workshop, a stranger shaking her hand and saying, "I'm glad you're doing better." As time went on, Karen's presence at the community center evolved from volunteer to mentor. She helped organize fundraisers, coordinated outreach programs, and even spearheaded a campaign to provide free counseling services for struggling families. Her dedication earned her the trust and admiration of those around her, proving that redemption isn't about erasing the past. It's about creating a future worth believing in. Though scars remained, Karen embraced them as reminders of how far she'd come and how much farther she hoped to go. Years had passed since the day Karen poured paint on the Royal Guard, but her journey toward redemption was far from over. The woman who once craved attention for all the wrong reasons now stood quietly outside a courthouse, volunteering at a legal aid clinic that offered free assistance to people in need. Her days of flashy clothes and designer handbags were long behind her. Instead, she wore simple outfits and carried a worn tote bag filled with paperwork. It was a modest life, but it was one she had earned through hard work and humility. Karen's memoir had become a staple in classrooms and community centers, sparking discussions about accountability and personal growth. Teachers used it as a tool to teach students about the importance of empathy and cultural awareness, while counselors recommended it to clients struggling to overcome their own mistakes. Though not everyone forgave her, many admired her determination to turn her life around. "You didn't have to do this," a colleague once remarked during a break at the clinic. "Most people would have just disappeared." Karen smiled faintly, but disappearing wouldn't fix anything. Her mornings usually began with a cup of tea and a few moments of reflection. Sitting by the window of her small apartment, she'd write in her journal, jotting down thoughts about the day ahead or lessons she'd learned recently. Some entries were celebratory, like when a teenager she mentored graduated high school despite overwhelming odds. Others were harder to process, like the occasional hateful message reminding her of her past. But Karen no longer let negativity derail her progress. Instead, she channeled her energy into helping others, finding purpose in every challenge. One crisp autumn morning, Karen received an unexpected letter. It was from the family of the Royal Guard she had humiliated years ago. At first, she feared the worst, a final condemnation, perhaps even threats. But as she unfolded the paper, her eyes widened in disbelief. The note was brief but heartfelt. "We don't agree with what you did, but we see how much you've changed. Thank you for trying to make amends." Tears streamed down Karen's face as she read the words over and over again. For so long, she had assumed forgiveness was out of reach. This small gesture reminded her that healing was possible, even if it came slowly. Later that week, Karen attended a fundraising gala hosted by the community center where she had volunteered for years. The event celebrated the opening of a new youth leadership program designed to empower underserved teens. As she stood on stage accepting an award for her contributions, Karen felt a lump rise in her throat. Looking out at the crowd, she saw Malik sitting proudly in the front row, clapping along with everyone else. "This isn't my victory," she said softly into the microphone. "It belongs to all of you for believing in me when I didn't believe in myself." The applause that followed wasn't loud or thunderous, but it was genuine. And that meant more to Karen than any standing ovation ever could. Afterward, strangers approached her to share stories of how her workshops or book had impacted their lives. A mother thanked her for teaching her daughter the value of kindness, while a young man credited her advice for helping him resolve conflicts at school. Each conversation reinforced the idea that her efforts mattered, that even someone with a troubled past could create positive change. Still, Karen knew her journey wasn't perfect. There were days when old habits threatened to resurface and nights when memories of her lowest moments kept her awake. She often wondered if she truly deserved the second chance life had given her. But then she'd remember the faces of the people she'd helped, the smiles, the hugs, the quiet thank yous, and realize that redemption wasn't about perfection. It was about effort, consistency, and the willingness to keep moving forward. As she walked home that evening, Karen paused under a street lamp to check her phone. A notification popped up. Another donation had come in for the youth leadership program, this time accompanied by a note that read, "Keep going. You're making the difference." She smiled to herself, feeling the warmth spread through her chest. Redemption wasn't easy, and it certainly wasn't quick, but it was worth it. And though scars from her past would always remain, Karen finally felt at peace knowing she was using them to build a brighter future, not just for herself, but for others too.